back to the Claremont Classic Garage. Our connecting rod bearings finally showed up, so we can go ahead now and put the rest of our 8N tractor engine back together. We've already gone ahead and got numbers 1, 2, and 3 installed. It was just pretty straightforward. And we'll do the whole job now on number 4, and we'll show you how that's going to go. So if you recall from our previous video, we had stuck rings on this, and unfortunately trying to loosen one up, I broke it. But I found out you can actually buy rings for 1 cylinder. So that's what we did. So we'll get these old rings out of here and get the grooves all cleaned up and put our new rings on and put this thing home. So this is going to be a common procedure on an engine that's had water in it. This one had water in it, and it sat for a little while like that. So we're going to see about getting these out of here. That piece is stuck in there really good. I'm probably going to have to warm it up a bit. I might try just getting the pick in behind it and popping it out. I did have it kind of moving just before I broke it. So once you've got your old rings out, you just get a hunk of the broken one, and you use that to work around and clean all the junk out of the ring groove. It takes a bit of time, but just be patient and work at it, and you'll get it. So we got the old rings off. I left the bottom oil ring on because I'm a cheapskate, and I just bought a set of rings for a 3-ring piston. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, another thing I wanted to tell you, an old Sawzall blade is really great for helping you clean out these rings. For the amount that I screw around with this thing, I really should have a ring groove cleaning tool, but I've never had one. I've always just used a broken ring. Sometimes we used to tape a couple of hacksaw blades together and use that, but this works pretty well. Anyway, you can see here the difference. This is a 3-ring piston. This is what these N tractors came with from the factory. And down the line, guys wanted to rebuild them. And they would have oil pumpers, but they didn't really want to put a set of sleeves in it. So the aftermarket came up with a solution, which was the 4-ring piston. So the top end of it is the same as factory. The ring dimensions are all the same. And then at the bottom, they added the 4th groove and put a second oil control ring in. So that's what pistons this thing had in it. And the sleeves do have a bit of taper to them. So we'll stick with the 4-ring piston. Now, as far as orientation, the tractor pistons do not use an offset pin. And yes, it does have an arrow for front, but you can, in reality, put them in either way and they'll work just fine. In fact, these 4-ring pistons are not even marked front. But you'll notice on one side, it's got this slot cut in it. So what I did was, this is which way they were in. They were in with this being front. So we carried on with that. And the rods, right in the manual, I've got an old 9N service manual, and it says the oil hole in the rod can face the front or the back. It doesn't matter. I just put them all facing to the front for the sake of uniformity. Now we can go ahead and put our rings on. We'll start at the bottom and work our way up. So first thing that's going to go on is the expander for the oil ring. So you want to get that on, and you want to make sure that the 2 ends don't climb over each other, you know, like that. That's bad. You want them just butted against each other, and you got to make sure you remember where the gap is, because we're going to stagger the gaps on the oil rings, the actual scraper rings. You want one over here and one over there, so you haven't got gaps lining up. So we're going to put that over there. We're going to use our little ring expanding tool here. I always forget I have this. I don't think it'll even work on these little oil rings. Nope, it won't. They're too thin. So we're going to do it the old-fashioned way with our thumbs. These are pretty resilient. These don't break like compression rings break. There we go. So You want to make sure that it's free, right? And the gap on the scraper ring is there, and the gap on our expander is there. So now we're going to put the top one on with the gap over here. It's all about staggering your gaps, people. So this one can go on. The expander on these is a tiny bit different than the expander that came out of it, but that I'm pretty sure is just a manufacturer thing. Okay, so there, that's good. And now we're going to put our compression rings on, and you'll see they're usually marked. If they want it to go one side up, it'll be marked. This one's actually etched, top. Sometimes they'll just have a dot. And what you can see, if you can see there on the back side of it, there's a tiny little chamfer. And the idea of that is that lets compression get at that chamfer and push the ring out to seal to the cylinder wall. So now we can use our fancy schmancy little tool here, and on it goes. And then the number 1 compression ring, same thing. You'll see it's marked top. Top, that doesn't mean top compression ring, that means this is the top. Number 1 means it's the top ring. And then we'll just put that on like that. And make sure that they all turn, because remember we are scraping a lot of crud out of those, and you want to make sure that there's not a great big gap or you end up with ring flutter, and that's bad, but these are good. Okay. I really hope you people out there in YouTube land are more interested in what I'm doing than these two are. So how I usually do this is I like the gaps on my compression rings to be 180 degrees out of each other. Like that. And I don't like them in line with the wrist pin. I like them 90 degrees from the wrist pin. And then the oil ring, the gaps are, there, we'll just turn them, I kind of like them like that. And that's good. Something I forgot to do, I forgot to show you. Oops! We should have put these rings down in the bore and checked the gap on them. My mistake. In fact, you know what? We're going to do that right now. We'll just pop the top compression ring off, and I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to check our ring gap. First thing we do is get the ring in the bore, and we just use a piston to get it squared up. There. And push it down a little bit, because your sleeve will have a little bit of taper in it, and as it goes down it'll open up. So the manual says 12 to 17 thousandths, and I could tell by looking at that we got a little more than that. So our ring gap is a little excessive because the bore is pretty wore out, but hey, it is what it is. Like I said, it was running okay. It just had that little bit of low compression in this cylinder because the rings were stuck. I checked number 2. I checked the other 3. Number 2 is just as worn as this one. So, and I had, it was, the compression was reasonable in number 2. So, what the heck? We're just gonna let it go. We'll see how she runs. Once we've got our rings on and we're happy with that, we're just going to go ahead and oil her up. You can't put too much oil on. It'll be smoky when it first starts, but it'll be okay. You can also just stick that thing right in there and let it soak if you want. But this will get plenty on there. Get the wrist pin. And we've got our bearing shell in the rod. The upper and lower bearing shells are the same. So if you're putting new ones, it doesn't matter which one goes where. If you're putting used ones, just make a note when you take it apart and put them back. We'll oil up our bore here. An interesting thing that I found on some of these old engines is there's 2 different sleeves that it can have. There's the early sleeves, which were 40 thousandths of an inch thick. So they were steel, And then I think starting in 1950 or 51, they switched to a cast iron sleeve, which was 90 thousandths of an inch thick. So with the 40 thou sleeves, so that's 9 ends, 2 ends, and early 8 ends, there were some enterprising guys that used to sell 80 over pistons. So you would basically just knock the sleeve out, give it a hone, and put 80 over pistons and rings in it. And that was a way to get back to a nice straight bore without having to put sleeves in it. The problem with that is, while it seemed like a good idea, because these blocks are made to have sleeves in them, they don't have the nickel content that a normal cylinder block would have. So they can't take the rings scraping up and down them, and they wear fast and they wear bad. And once that's happened, the only thing you can do is take it to a machine shop and have it bored out to accept the 90 thousandths thick sleeves, like from a later 8N, or you just have to have it bored and a proper machine shop press-in sleeve put in it, and that's the end of that. I've seen a lot of blocks ruined by that. Now we've got our rings oiled up. We got a ring compressor. Oh, I got one. There we go. Just let them sit there for a minute. That'll kind of go through by capillary action. And we're going to put this in here. You leave just a tiny bit of the piston sticking out the bottom. And we'll tighten her up. There we go. So that's good. We've got oil on our shell. Now we go over here. I've marked this front with an arrow with a Sharpie. And you just get it started in there. Yeah. Oh, and it's a nice idea to put a pair of bolt buddies on your rod bolts so you don't bang up the crankshaft. And then I just use this piece of nylon here. There we are, she's home. Now we'll flip it over and put the cap on. When you put these together, the bearing tangs, always both on the same side. And once it's in, torque it up. I've been torquing these to 35. I'm going to go, they're all 4 torqued to 35. And when I've done this, I'm going to go in the manual and double check and make sure I did it right. Now that we've got our last rod torqued up, we're going to make sure she still turns. You can feel now, because that's got new rings on it, you can feel the drag. And you can hear them too. So that's good. So when you're doing this, each thing you do, just keep turning the engine. Like when you put the crankshaft in, just tighten the mains down by hand and make sure it turns. And then torque them one by one and make sure it turns. And when you put the rods in, do them, torque them one at a time and make sure it turns. That way, if you have a problem, you can kind of know the area where the problem is. Anyway, I'm going to double check that torque value, and I'll be right back. Manual says 45 to 50 on these, so the older stuff gets the more leery of it I get. So we're going to stay at the lower end of the scale and we'll torque them at 45. They just move just a tiny bit. And these two buggers here, there's one. Let me turn it a bit to get that last one. There we go. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and start closing this thing up. So the first thing we have to do is get the timing cover on, and we have to install the front seal. So these are rope seals on these things, and you just you work it in with a socket into that groove there. And as tempting as it is, don't cut off the excess. First we install the governor adapter onto the side of the block, and make sure you just put a little bit of silicone at the ends of it where all these housings are going to meet, because that's a place where oil could wick out. Our gasket was pretty old and it had shrunk some, so we just threw it in a bucket of water for 5 minutes and now it's good to go. So we'll go ahead and I'll glue it onto the cover with a bit of silicone. We'll silicone up the ends and then we'll get the cover on. These bolts, they're 3/8 course. We'll torque them to 35 foot-pounds. So what I do is, because this piece, you can imagine, you're pulling it that way with bolts and you're pulling it this way with bolts. So what I do is I wind these down just snug but not tight. So the tension of the lock washer holds it against the block. And then I tighten these two first. I torque these two. So I've got this cover torqued nicely all the way around. Then I come back and torque those ones. Now we're going to close up the bottom of it. I went ahead and put the crankshaft pulley on. That way when we crush the front seal down in, it's not going to want to go, into where the pulley is. Man, I'm terrible at explaining things, aren't I? Anyway, now is the time to put the pulley on. Before we put the pan on, we have to fit the gaskets. When these things come out of the package, they're too long. They reach up right to the crankshaft. So we cut them off so that they're, you see, beside the seal like that. You don't want any gasket in there. That'll let oil wick out. And it'll put too much crunch on the seal. So we've got that done on both sides. Next thing we're going to do is, after we put the timing cover on before the pan, anywhere where there's gasket sticking out, we'll just get a razor blade and clean it off. There's nothing over on this side. We're okay here. You can see there, like, that's a little proud. Thankfully the pan gasket is quite thick and it'll take that up, but we'll put some silicone there and there. And on that parting line, I've already gone ahead and put some at where the gaskets butt onto the ends of the seals. I also put a little silicone where the gasket will butt the rear main seal and along here where the rear main seal retainer is, because we're not 100% sure if that's all at precisely the same level. I've got the rear and front seal halves installed in our oil pan. Using the same method as we did on the block, just soaked them in oil for a few hours and then worked them down in there with a socket. Make sure you've got roughly the same amount sticking up on either side, and don't cut off the excess. Then I've put 4 old carburetor studs here in the pan rail just to guide the oil pan straight down. Now we can work our way around and pull it down evenly with the speeder. We'll just start in the middle and kind of work our way out in a circle. And then we can come back with the torque wrench and make sure they're all even. Now we'll go around and start torquing these up. They're just little 5/16 bolts, and they're very old. 20 to 25 is my kind of ballpark for 5/16 bolts. So we're going to torque these to 20 and see how they feel, with the option of possibly going up to 25. And you just work your way around, kind of crisscross, and work your way around in an ever-growing circle. The first ones will feel kind of spongy because you're pulling the pan down and squishing the gasket, and it might make them feel like they're getting a little stretchy. But once you get going around, you kind of get the feel for it, and as your circle gets bigger, they'll start feeling a little better. And then they'll all feel good the second time you go around. Now we'll make our second pass at 20 and see if any of them move. A little bit. Yeah, they all feel good. So we'll leave them at 20, I think. No sense pushing our luck. Now we can put in the strainer, and this is very important. This is the first line of defense for your engine. These 8N engines have an oil filter, but it is not a full flow filter like what you would have on your car, for instance. In your car, the oil pump picks up the oil through the pickup, sends the entire flow, that's why it's called full flow, through the oil filter, and then it goes to the engine. Whereas on these tractors, this is pretty much the only thing that filters the oil. It goes through the engine, and then it comes out here. It comes out this bung here, and that's just on your main gallery, and only a portion of the oil actually goes through the filter. It's continuous. I mean, the filter is always working, but it's not full flow. So you have to make sure that this thing is there. A lot of times these things get destroyed and people will just tear them off and put the plug back in. Now your engine is just sucking up whatever crap and garbage is in the pan and circulating through there. So you got to make sure this is there. So we got it, we cleaned it all up, put a new gasket on it, and you can see there's the pickup. It's not perfectly lined up, but that's fine. You just make sure that goes inside the pickup and screw it in. It's a little bit of a chore, but it goes in. There we go. A lot of times you'll find these things underneath there, and people don't have you're supposed to use a 1 1/16 wrench. I've got this. And they get in there tight, and they get all mangled and destroyed, and they can be fun to get out. Another thing you want to make sure while we're underneath here, this cotter pin. Everybody always asks, what is that cotter pin for? There's one here at the back of the engine, and there's another one at the back of the transmission. And all that this does, it's a weep hole, so that any oil that gets past your rear main seal, because it's not exactly a lip seal, it's a rope seal, and they do seep a little bit of oil. So all this does is there's a weep hole at the bottom to let that oil out, and the job of this cotter pin is to just rattle around in there while the engine's running to keep that hole free at all times. Now we have to install in the timing cover our oil pressure relief valve. So it's this long thing. If the oil pressure goes too high, like on a stone cold engine, it'll unseat this and dump some of it back to the sump. So that just goes in there. This is a lot of times gets lost when engines get taken apart, and guys will start them up and there's no oil pressure. Another thing that this little hole is good for is if you have one that's been sitting for a long time and the oil pump has gone dry and it won't pick up oil, you pull this out and squirt some oil down there, and it'll kind of prime the pump and help it get started. So we just put that in there like that. Now, the gasket they give you in the kit is terrible. It looks like a door lock gasket for a car. That's no good. So I found this copper washer that fits a lot better, so we'll use that. Unfortunately, I don't have in my pocket the wrench to tighten this, but you'll just have to take my word for it that I tightened it, and I'll be back in a minute. Now we can go ahead and put the cylinder head on. So I've got everything all cleaned here. The deck is good and clean. All we have to do is put the studs back in. I usually put the studs back in with the head gasket in place. It's a lot easier than trying to jiggle the head gasket down over all them studs. Something else I would like to show you is that you'll notice, because they weren't sure, I guess, about production tolerances, if the sleeves maybe would be sometimes a tiny bit proud or a tiny bit deep. You can see that the fire rings sit on the deck of the block, not the top of the sleeve. That's very important, because, I mean, these ones, you can see the sleeves are down a bit. This would never seal if it sat on top of the sleeves. But on this engine, it sits on top of the block, so we're good. Another thing you can see on this head gasket, which is something that was kind of an old mechanic's trick, after it was made, it was painted with aluminum paint. And that's kind of like a head gasket sealer. This is what we used to do, like we'd pull the head off of one of these things and want to put it back on. If the head gasket still looked okay, we'd just give it a good coat of aluminum spray paint on both sides and put her back in, and they would be just fine. That's interesting to see. Not really a lot to put in all these studs in. It just takes a few minutes. So you just jam 2 nuts on them, put a little oil on the coarse end, and wind her down in. And next thing you know, you'll have them all done. We've got almost all of the studs in now, except these 2 at the front. And I've left them out on purpose because I want to show you something. If you are converting your tractor to 12 volts and using a Chevy alternator with one of the kits that you get to put them on, it'll come with one of these brackets. And if you install the original 2 studs back, when you torque it down, because this thing is 1/4 of an inch thick, you only get about that much sticking up to put your nut on. So what I normally do, if you've got access to some old end tractor or an old Ferguson sitting somewhere, or you've scrapped one out before, these studs are a little bit longer, see? And I'll show you where you get them from. They go here on the side of the tractor, so they pass through the cup and the cap for the radius rod. These are exactly the right length for a alternator bracket, and you'll still have good thread sticking out. Even if you don't have a scrap tractor sitting around, you can steal these. You just need 2 of them out of your tractor and go get 2 7/16 bolts at an auto parts store or a hardware store to replace them with. Way better than using these. You could probably even just get those to work. Just don't put them in all the way. It's a lot less critical than the cylinder head. Now we can lower our cylinder head down. I've got it all cleaned up. I put some oil on the threads on these studs so we can lower it down. There we go. Now, you can see here, these 2 for the alternator bracket stick up a little proud. I'll get all the nuts started. We'll run them down with the speeder, and then we'll torque them up. Now it's time to torque the cylinder head. We're going to do it in 2 stages. The first step, I'm going to torque them to about 35, and then the second step, we'll do 55. And like I said before, you work your way out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on and so forth. You work your way out from the center. So, I've done 35, 55, and now I'm just going to hit them again at 55 and make 100% sure that we got them all. I've done this a few times. Then once the engine is installed on the tractor and we start dressing it up, we have to remove these two to put the wire tube, and we'll remove these two to put the alternator bracket. Well, that'll do it for this one. We've got our engine back together in one piece. In the next video, we'll marry it back to the tractor and get the outside of it all dressed up so she's ready to run. Until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Claremont Classic Garage. So long.